My name is Beth Parker, and I'm 27 years old. I'm a nature photographer, an odd mix of passion and profession that's taken me to some of the most beautiful remote places in the country. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared me for what happened during that weekend in Tickfaw State Park, Louisiana. I thought I was going for peace, inspiration, and maybe a few portfolio-worthy shots. What I found was something I still can't fully explain. It all began on a Friday afternoon. I'd convinced my ex-boyfriend Ryan, 29, with a practical streak that bordered on annoying, to join me for the trip. He had an RV, an older model with a tendency to sputter and complain like an arthritic old man, but it was reliable enough. Then there was Laura, my best friend since college. She was 26, a city girl through and through, and had only agreed to come because she hated the thought of me venturing into the wilderness with my ex. Tickfaw State Park was a postcard of southern beauty. Lush cypress trees, swampy waterways, and Spanish moss that dripped from the branches like ghostly veils. We set up camp in a secluded spot by the river. The air was thick and humid, buzzing with mosquitoes, but the scene was perfect for my camera. "Just imagine," I told Laura as I unpacked my gear, "the way the sunset will hit the water. This is going to be amazing." Laura swatted at a mosquito and rolled her eyes. "I'll imagine it from the RV, thanks." That first night, things felt off, though I couldn't say why. It was too quiet. No chirping insects, no croaking frogs, just the occasional creak of the RV settling on its tires. Ryan, ever the skeptic, brushed it off when I mentioned it. "Nature's not a movie, Beth," he said, fiddling with the generator that had already given us trouble. "Sometimes it's quiet. You should be grateful." Still, a chill ran through me as I gazed out into the dark woods. The trees seemed to loom closer, their silhouettes sharper under the pale moonlight. The next day, we ventured deeper into the park. I had spotted a grove of cypress trees the day before, their trunks rising like ancient columns from the water, and I was determined to photograph it. Ryan and Laura trailed behind me, complaining about the heat and the bugs. My camera felt like an extension of my arm as I framed the perfect shot. That's when I noticed it. A figure in the background, tall and gaunt, standing between the trees. I lowered the camera and squinted, but the figure was gone. "Did you see that?" I asked. Ryan glanced up from his phone. "See what?" "Someone out there," I said, pointing. "Tall, just standing there." Laura grabbed my arm. "Don't say stuff like that, Beth. You're freaking me out." Ryan smirked. "Probably another camper or a ranger. Relax." But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. That night, the whispers started. I was in the RV, reviewing the day's photos on my laptop. Laura was reading, and Ryan was tinkering with the generator again. Then faintly I heard it, a voice, soft and indistinct, calling my name. "Beth." I froze, my heart pounding. "Did you hear that?" I asked Laura. She looked up, frowning. "Hear what?" Someone said my name. Laura's face paled. "Don't mess with me, Beth. I swear, if you're trying to scare me—" "I'm not," I insisted. Ryan stomped back into the RV, wiping grease from his hands. "What's going on now?" I told him, but he just laughed. "It's the wind," he said. "Or your imagination. You're always looking for something spooky to photograph." That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak, every rustle sent my nerves on edge. The whispers came again, faint but insistent, and I swore I heard footsteps circling the RV. The next day, I made the mistake of returning to the grove alone. I needed answers, or at least some peace of mind, and I told myself that maybe getting some good photos would help. The grove was eerily still, the air heavy with the scent of damp earth. I wandered through the trees, my camera clicking as I framed shot after shot. That's when I found it. An old stone altar, half buried in moss and mud. It was covered in carvings, humanoid figures with elongated limbs and twisted, animal-like features. Fascinated, I snapped several pictures. Then I heard it again. The voice. Beth. It was closer this time and unmistakably real. I turned, my breath catching in my throat. A figure stood at the edge of the grove, tall and impossibly thin, with glowing eyes that burned like coals. Its head was misshapen, almost like a deer's skull, but its body was disturbingly human. I ran. Back at the RV, I told Ryan and Laura what I'd seen. Laura wanted to leave immediately, but Ryan was skeptical as ever. "You probably saw a shadow or an animal," he said. "This whole place is playing tricks on you." "It wasn't a trick, Ryan," I snapped. "It was real, and it's following us." That night, the creature made itself known. The RV shook as something clawed at the sides, its nails scraping metal with a sound that made my skin crawl. Laura screamed, and Ryan grabbed a flashlight. But when he opened the door, there was nothing there. Just the dark woods and the oppressive silence. We tried to leave, but the RV wouldn't start. The GPS was useless, showing nothing but static. My phone and camera were dead. "We're trapped," Laura whispered, her voice trembling. Desperation set in. I remembered the altar and the carvings, and an idea took root in my mind. "It's tied to the altar," I said. "We disturbed it and now it's after us. Maybe we can fix it, give it something to leave us alone." Ryan was reluctant, but eventually agreed. We gathered items that felt significant: my camera memory card, Laura's bracelet, Ryan's pocket knife, and returned to the grove. The creature was waiting for us. It emerged from the shadows, its glowing eyes fixed on me. I placed the items on the altar, trembling, and whispered a plea for it to leave us in peace. For a moment, everything was still. Then the creature lunged. Ryan shoved me aside, yelling for Laura to run. The last thing I saw was the creature dragging him into the darkness, its skeletal limbs impossibly fast. Laura and I stumbled back to the RV, tears streaming down our faces. The engine roared to life, and we drove until we reached the nearest town. I never saw Ryan again. The photos I took that weekend were all corrupted, black smudges and glowing eyes where the creature had been. I've stopped photographing the wilderness since then, but sometimes late at night, I hear whispers calling my name. My name is Jake Calloway, and I'm 32 years old. I've been living out of my RV for the past 2 years, traveling across the country to document some of the most remote and beautiful places I can find. It's not the most glamorous life, but it's mine. My small YouTube channel is enough to keep gas in the tank and food in the fridge, and I'm okay with that. What I wasn't okay with was what happened at Tunica Hills Wildlife Management Area in Louisiana. That trip changed everything. It started like any other adventure. I'd heard about Tunica Hills from a friend who told me it was a hidden gem, rugged trails, towering bluffs, and the kind of eerie beauty that made for great photos and even better stories. It sounded perfect for my channel, so I planned to stay for a weekend. I arrived on a late Friday afternoon. The drive through the area was stunning. Dense forests with sunlight filtering through the canopy, the kind of place that felt ancient, untouched. As I pulled into the park entrance, I noticed a woman standing by the side of the road, her thumb out. She looked young, maybe mid-20s, with a backpack slung over her shoulder. Hitchhikers weren't uncommon in these parts, but something about her gave me pause. Still, I figured it wouldn't hurt to give her a lift. "You heading into the park?" I asked as I rolled down the window. She nodded, her face calm but hard to read. "Yeah. You mind?" "Sure. Hop in," I said. Her name was Evelyn, or Evie, as she preferred to be called. She wasn't much for small talk, but when I mentioned I was documenting the area for my channel, her eyes lit up. "You picked an interesting place," she said, her voice low and measured. "What do you mean?" "It's got stories," she replied, almost like she was weighing her words. "People say these woods are cursed," I chuckled. "Yeah, every park has its ghost stories." What's the curse here? Evie hesitated, then shrugged. Just don't mess with anything you don't understand. The way she said it sent a chill down my spine, but I brushed it off. She asked me to drop her off near a trailhead, and I watched as she disappeared into the trees without so much as a goodbye. I found a secluded spot near one of the bluffs and parked the RV. The air was thick with the scent of pine and earth, and the only sounds were the rustling leaves and the occasional bird call. It was perfect. That first night, I started to feel the strangeness Evie had hinted at. As I was editing footage in the RV, I heard it, a soft tapping on the window. At first I thought it was a branch in the wind, but when I looked outside, there wasn't a tree close enough to reach the RV. The tapping came again, this time from the opposite side. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped out, my breath clouding in the cool night air. The forest was still. Too still. "Hello?" I called out, but my voice sounded small against the towering trees. Nothing answered. I went back inside, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. The next morning, I set out to explore the trails, camera in hand. Tunica Hills was even more breathtaking than I'd imagined. Steep bluffs rising like walls, narrow paths winding through dense foliage, and sunlight casting long shadows across the forest floor. That's when I found it. A small doll, crudely made from twigs and string, was propped against a tree at the edge of the trail. Its face was eerily detailed, carved into the wood with an unsettling precision. "Who leaves this kind of thing out here?" I muttered, snapping a photo of it. As I turned to leave, I felt a sudden chill, like the temperature had dropped 10 degrees. The forest, already quiet, seemed to press in on me, the air heavy with something I couldn't name. By the time I got back to the RV, my head was pounding, and I felt uneasy in a way I couldn't shake. I reviewed the footage from the day, but my camera had glitched, distorting the images into strange, warped shapes. That night, the tapping returned. This time it was louder, more insistent. Then came the whispers, soft, indistinct, but unmistakable. "Jake." I froze. The voice was faint, but it was mine. "Who's out there?" I yelled, grabbing a flashlight and swinging the door open. The forest stared back, silent and impenetrable. As I stepped outside, my flashlight flickered, then went out. I heard footsteps behind me, slow, deliberate, and spun around, but no one was there. "Jake!" The voice whispered again, closer now. I bolted back into the RV and locked the door, my heart pounding like a drum. The next morning, I was ready to leave. I packed up and tried to start the RV, but the engine wouldn't turn over. I checked the battery, the fuel line, everything I could think of, but it was like the RV was dead. That's when Old Man Rivers showed up. He was a wiry, weathered man with a cane, his face a map of wrinkles. He appeared out of nowhere, tapping on the RV window like it was the most normal thing in the world. "You shouldn't be here," he said when I opened the door. "Yeah, no kidding. My RV won't start. Can you help?" He shook his head. "It ain't the RV, it's her." "Her?" "The witch," he said, his voice a gravelly whisper. "These woods are hers, and she don't like strangers." I stared at him, waiting for him to crack a smile, but he didn't. "Look," I said, "I don't believe in that stuff." "You will," he said, turning to leave. "You will." That evening, I saw her. I was hiking back to the trail where I'd found the doll, hoping to find a signal for my phone. The sun was setting, casting long, blood-red shadows through the trees. That's when I saw Evelyn, or at least, I thought it was her. She was standing at the edge of the trail, her back to me. "Evie," I called, but she didn't turn around. As I approached, her figure flickered, like a TV losing signal, and then she was gone. In her place stood a tall, gaunt figure, draped in tattered cloth, its face hidden beneath a hood. I stumbled back, my legs refusing to move. The figure raised an arm, and I felt a pressure in my chest, like invisible hands were squeezing the air out of me. "Leave." It hissed, the voice echoing in my head. Back at the RV, I knew I had to do something. The doll, the symbols, the voice. They all pointed to one thing. The altar. I followed the whispers, deeper into the forest than I'd ever gone. The trees closed in around me, the air thick with the stench of decay. Finally I found it. A circle of stones, weathered and ancient, at the center of which burned a green flame. The doll was there, along with others, each one more grotesque than the last. Evelyn stood beside the flame, her face pale and expressionless. "You shouldn't have come here," she said. "What is this?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "She owns this place," Evelyn said. "And now she owns you." "No," I said, stepping forward. "This ends now." I grabbed the doll with my face and hurled it into the flame. The forest erupted in a deafening roar, the ground shaking beneath me. The last thing I saw was the witch's shadow rising from the flame, her eyes burning like coals. I woke up at the park's entrance, my RV parked nearby, the engine running like nothing had ever happened. But I wasn't the same. Every time I look in a mirror, I see her face, twisted, smiling, waiting, and every night I hear her voice. Jake. My name is Lila Carter, and I'm 28 years old. I've been traveling solo in my RV for the better part of a year, chasing inspiration for my next novel. Writing isn't just my passion, it's my lifeline. When I heard about Lake Foss Point State Park in Louisiana, with its haunting beauty and secluded trails, I knew it was where I needed to be. What I didn't know was that this trip would turn into a nightmare I can't forget, no matter how hard I try. It was late afternoon when I arrived at the park. The air was thick with humidity, the scent of moss and earth wrapping around me like a blanket. I parked my RV at a spot near the lake's edge, where the still water mirrored the gnarled cypress trees, their roots clawing at the swamp like ancient fingers. I was enchanted, and completely unprepared for what was to come. The first person I met was a park ranger named Tucker. He looked to be in his 40s, with a weathered face and an easy, quiet demeanor. "You planning to stay long?" he asked, handing me a map. "A couple of nights," I replied, looking for some inspiration. He raised an eyebrow. "Well, you'll find it here, that's for sure. Just don't wander too far off the trails, especially after dark." "Why not?" I asked, curious. He hesitated, then shrugged. "This place has its stories, that's all. Old swamp tales." I laughed, trying to lighten the mood. "I'm a writer. I live for stories like that." He didn't laugh back. "Be careful," he said simply, tipping his hat as he walked away. That first night, I felt the weight of the swamp's silence. It was so quiet, it almost hummed. I stayed inside the RV, typing away at a half-formed chapter, until I heard it. A faint splashing sound, like something moving in the water. I paused, listening. Then came the giggles. At first I thought I'd imagined it. But there it was again, the unmistakable laughter of children, soft and distant. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, the cool air raising goosebumps on my arms. The lake was calm, the surface like glass, but the giggles seemed to float on the air, coming from everywhere and nowhere. "Hello?" I called out. No response. The sound faded, leaving only the rustle of leaves. I shook my head, chalking it up to tiredness, and went back inside. The next morning, I found something strange. Tiny, wet footprints trailed from the edge of the water to the RV door. They were small, like a child's, but barefoot, and there were no other tracks around them. My stomach tightened as I stared at them. Determined not to let my imagination run wild, I set off for a hike. I followed a trail that wound deeper into the swamp, my boots crunching on the damp ground. The sunlight filtered through the canopy in broken shafts, painting the path with patches of gold. It was beautiful, but there was an uneasiness in the air that I couldn't shake. That's when I saw the cabin. It was half sunken, leaning precariously to one side. with moss and vines creeping over its weathered boards. Curiosity got the better of me, and I stepped inside. The floor was soft with rot, and the air smelled of mildew and something faintly sweet, like decayed flowers. On a rickety table, I found an odd collection of children's toys. A wooden horse, a small doll, and a ball, all arranged in a precise, unsettling line. I reached for the doll, and as my fingers brushed its worn fabric, a cold breeze swept through the cabin. The door creaked shut behind me, and for a split second, I thought I heard the faintest whisper. Stay. I didn't. By the time I returned to the RV, the unease had turned into full-blown paranoia. I couldn't stop thinking about the footprints, the toys, and that whisper. I needed answers, so I asked around at the park office. Most people brushed me off, but one fisherman, a wiry old man with a cigarette dangling from his lips, finally gave me something. "Sounds like you ran into Eloise Bertrand's kids," he said, exhaling a puff of smoke. "Or what's left of them." "Who's Eloise Bertrand?" I asked. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. "Old story. Back in the 1800s, Eloise lived in these parts with her 3 kids. Her husband left her, and she lost her mind. One night, she took the kids out to the swamp and drowned them. Some say she did it to keep them safe from the devil. Others say she was the devil. Either way, their spirits still wander the swamp, looking for company. A chill ran down my spine. And Eloise? She's still here too, they say, watching over her family." He flicked his cigarette. "Best to leave them be." That night, I didn't sleep. Around midnight, the children came again. This time, I saw them. I was sitting in the RV, trying to write, when I felt it, a presence, like I wasn't alone. I looked out the window and there they were, 3 pale, silent figures standing by the water's edge, their eyes dark and hollow. They didn't move, didn't speak, they just stared. My heart pounded as I grabbed my flashlight and swung the door open. "What do you want?" I shouted, but they didn't react. When I stepped closer, they vanished, melting into the mist. As I turned to go back inside, I saw something new. Carved into the RV door, deep and jagged, was a single word: stay. The next day, Tucker found me pacing by the lake, my nerves frayed. When I told him everything, his face darkened. "I warned you," he said. "You need to leave." "I can't," I said. "The RV won't start, and I feel like they won't let me." He nodded grimly. "They won't. Not until you give them what they want." "And what's that?" I asked. "Company," he said. That night was the worst. The children surrounded the RV, their pale faces pressing against the windows. Their breath fogged the glass, and their hollow eyes seemed to bore into my soul. I locked the doors, but I knew it wouldn't matter. The whispers came again, louder now, more insistent. "Come play," they said. "Stay with us." Desperate, I grabbed the doll from the cabin, hoping it might hold some kind of answer. The whispers grew louder as I held it, almost like it was alive. I remembered the fisherman's story, the toys in the cabin. These were their connections to this world. I knew what I had to do. I returned to the cabin, the children following me silently. Inside, I placed the doll on the table with the others, then lit a match. The flame caught quickly, devouring the toys as the air filled with the smell of burning wood and fabric. The whispers turned into screams, shrill and piercing, and the cabin shook around me. I stumbled outside as the ground beneath me seemed to pulse, the swamp itself coming alive. Then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The children were gone. I looked back at the cabin. It was silent now, but in the flickering light of the fire, I saw her, Eloise. Her face was gaunt and pale, her eyes filled with sorrow. She stared at me for a long moment before fading into the shadows, her presence leaving an emptiness that felt like relief and grief all at once. I managed to leave the next morning. The RV started without a hitch, and the road seemed to stretch endlessly behind me. but I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd left a part of myself in that swamp. I'm back on the road now, but I can't write. Not the way I used to. Every time I sit down at my laptop, the whispers come back, soft and distant. Stay. My name is Grant Rivers, and I'm 36 years old. For the past decade, I've been a wildlife photographer, traveling to remote places in search of untouched landscapes and creatures that tell stories better than people ever could. A few months ago, I came to the Creole Nature Trail in Louisiana to document its unique wetlands and wildlife for a book project. It was supposed to be just another stop on my journey. I couldn't have been more wrong. I arrived late in the afternoon. The drive through the desolate stretches of marshland had been long, the horizon flat and unbroken, except for occasional clusters of trees rising out of the mist. My RV rattled as I pulled into the designated camping area, the only sign of life being a lone heron that watched me with cold indifference. The stillness of the place was unsettling, but it was exactly what I needed to focus on my work. After setting up camp, I stepped outside to stretch and take in the landscape. The air was humid, thick with the smell of brine and earth. The sun dipped low in the sky, painting the wetlands in shades of gold and crimson. I snapped a few preliminary shots before heading back inside to plan my route for the next day. That's when I heard it, a faint whisper, so soft I almost thought I imagined it. I froze, listening. The whisper came again, drifting through the stillness. It was unintelligible, but it sounded human. I scanned the area, my eyes darting between the trees and tall grass. Nothing, just the heron, still perched by the water's edge, staring at me like it knew something I didn't. I locked the RV door that night, a habit I rarely kept when camping in the middle of nowhere. The next morning I set out early, eager to capture the wildlife before the heat of the day set in. The trail was marked on my map, but it didn't seem well traveled. The ground was soft beneath my boots, and the air was thick with the hum of insects. As I moved deeper into the wetlands, the world around me seemed to grow quieter. The birdsong faded, replaced by an eerie silence that pressed against my ears. A couple of hours in, I spotted movement ahead. At first, I thought it was another hiker, a woman, her silhouette framed by the mist. She was crouched near the water, her back to me. "Hello?" I called out. She jerked upright and turned to face me. She looked about my age, her face pale and drawn, her clothes mud-streaked and damp. Her wide eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment neither of us spoke. "Are you okay?" I asked, stepping closer. "I've been lost," she said, her voice trembling. "I don't know how long. Days, maybe." I glanced at the trail behind her. "How did you get here?" "This trail loops back to the main road." She shook her head. "No, it doesn't. Not anymore." Her words didn't make sense, but she was clearly shaken. I offered to walk her back to my RV, but she insisted on staying by the water. "I'll find my way," she said, though her eyes betrayed her uncertainty. Reluctantly, I left her there and continued down the trail, my mind replaying the encounter. Something about her didn't sit right, but I couldn't put my finger on it. By midday, the trail seemed to stretch farther than it should have. According to my map, I should have already reached the loop back to my starting point, but the path kept going, winding deeper into the wetlands. The markers on the trees, simple carvings of arrows, looked freshly made, as if someone had been here recently. I stopped to take a photo, and when I checked my camera, the timestamp was wrong. It said I'd been out for 9 hours, though it felt like half that. As I stood there trying to make sense of it, I noticed something in the distance. Shadows. They were human-shaped, just beyond the next bend, standing motionless. My breath caught in my throat. "Hello," I called out. The shadows didn't move. I stepped closer, but as I rounded the bend, they were gone. I found my way back to the RV just before dusk, shaken, but relieved to be out of the woods. My relief was short-lived. As I approached, I saw something scratched into the side of the RV, a single word: leave. I spun around, scanning the area, but there was no one there. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled. Was it her? The woman I'd met on the trail? Or was someone else out here watching me? I decided to leave first thing in the morning. Whatever was happening here, I didn't want to stick around to find out. That night, I couldn't sleep. The whispers returned, louder this time, circling the RV like an invisible chorus. Then came the knocking, soft, deliberate on the windows. I gripped the edge of the bed, my pulse pounding. The shadows from earlier flashed in my mind. I didn't dare look outside. I stayed in the darkness, listening to the whispers grow fainter until they finally stopped. When morning came, I packed up as quickly as I could and turned the ignition. The RV didn't start. Desperation gnawed at me. I decided to hike back to the main road and flag down help. As I stepped onto the trail, the woman appeared again, standing in the exact same spot as before. Her clothes were still damp, her expression unreadable. "You're still here?" I asked, incredulous. "I told you," she said, her voice hollow. "The trail doesn't lead where it should." I clenched my jaw. "That's nonsense. There's always a way out." Her gaze shifted behind me, and I followed it. The shadows were there again, closer this time. They stood in silence, their forms almost blending into the mist. My stomach dropped. "What are they?" I whispered. "They're the ones who stayed too long," she said. "You need to leave before it's too late." Her warning echoed in my mind as I pressed deeper into the wetlands. The trail seemed different now, as if it had rearranged itself overnight. The markers were gone, replaced by crude symbols carved into the trees, spirals, crosses, and shapes I couldn't recognize. I heard footsteps behind me and spun around, expecting to see the woman. Instead, it was an old man, leaning on a cane. His face was weathered, his eyes sharp. "You shouldn't be here," he said. "I know," I replied. "I'm trying to get out." He shook his head. "The trail won't let you, not unless you find the source." "What source?" I asked, frustration creeping into my voice. "The stone," he said cryptically. "It binds this place. Destroy it, and you'll be free." Before I could ask more, he turned and disappeared into the trees. I found the stone just before dusk, hidden deep in the wetlands. It was an obelisk, covered in moss and strange carvings that pulsed faintly with light. The air around it felt heavy, like the atmosphere before a storm. The shadows were there too, circling the stone, their presence suffocating. The woman appeared beside me, her expression desperate. "You have to destroy it," she said. "It's the only way." As I stepped closer, the world seemed to warp around me. The ground shifted and my vision blurred. The shadows closed in, their forms twisting into grotesque shapes. My hands shook as I raised my camera, the only weapon I had. The flash went off, illuminating the obelisk in a burst of light. The sound was deafening. The stone cracked, its light exploding outward, consuming everything in a blinding flash. I woke up in the RV, parked exactly where I'd started. The air was still, the wetlands silent. The scratches on the RV were gone, and my camera lay on the counter, its memory card corrupted. As I drove away, I glanced at the rearview mirror. The shadows were gone, but the woman's reflection lingered, her hollow eyes watching me until I crossed the park's boundary. I haven't touched the photo since. Some places I've learned aren't meant to be captured. Some stories aren't meant to be told. My name is Riley Quinn, and I'm 31 years old. I'm a music teacher by profession, but my real passion is experimenting with sound. For years, I've taken trips to remote places to record the sounds of nature. Wind through the trees, water lapping against rocks, even the songs of birds, and weaving them into my compositions. My latest stop was the Atchafalaya Basin in Louisiana, a sprawling swamp known for its haunting beauty and eerie isolation. I was excited to be there, but I should have listened to the warnings. I never imagined sound itself could become a weapon against me. The first night, I parked my RV in a clearing by the water. The swamp was breathtaking. Cypress trees rose like ancient sentinels from the still, dark water, their roots twisting into impossible shapes. The air was thick with humidity, and the scent of moss and decay clung to everything. I set up my recording equipment and sat on a folding chair by the edge of the swamp, letting the microphone pick up the sounds around me. At first, it was exactly what I expected. Crickets chirping, frogs croaking, the occasional splash of a fish. But then I heard something strange. Faint, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. A melody. It wasn't a bird call or the wind. It sounded human. A soft, wordless humming that seemed to drift through the trees. I glanced around, but there was no one in sight. Just the water and the dense fog rolling in as the sun dipped below the horizon. I told myself it must have been my imagination, or maybe even a trick of the swamp's acoustics, and went inside the RV for the night. The next morning, I reviewed the audio I'd recorded. Most of it was as expected, but as I scrubbed through the file, my heart skipped a beat. There it was again, the humming, and this time, it was clearer. A haunting, lilting tune that sent chills down my spine. I played it back several times, trying to make sense of it. Then came the part that froze me in place. A voice, my voice. It was faint, but unmistakable. I was humming along with the melody, though I had no memory of doing so. I set the headphones down, my hands trembling. It had to be a mistake, a glitch in the recorder, maybe interference from something in the swamp. But as I stepped outside to get some air, I felt a prickle on the back of my neck, as if someone was watching me. That afternoon, I met Jonas, a fisherman who lived on a nearby houseboat. He was tying up a net when I approached, hoping to ask him about the sounds I'd recorded. "You hear things out here?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. "That's not surprising. This swamp's full of sounds it shouldn't have." "What do you mean?" I pressed. He leaned on his net, his eyes narrowing. "Folks call it the devil's choir. Voices, music, sometimes laughter. It mimics what it hears, plays it back to you like it's calling you deeper into the swamp. Most people know better than to follow." "And the people who don't?" I asked. He hesitated. "They don't come back." I wanted to laugh it off, but his tone left no room for doubt. "So it's a legend?" Jonas shook his head. "It's real enough. You'd do well to pack up and leave." I didn't leave. I told myself I'd come too far to let a creepy story scare me off, but the truth was, I was too intrigued. That night, I set up my equipment again, this time placing the microphone farther from the RV, closer to the edge of the water. As darkness fell, I sat inside and waited, my recorder running. The music came again, faint at first, but growing louder as the night deepened. It was the same melody, but now it was accompanied by other sounds. Soft piano notes, a violin's bow drawn across strings. My pulse quickened as I stepped outside to investigate, flashlight in hand. The swamp was alive with sound, but it wasn't natural. It was beautiful, intricate, like a symphony playing just beyond the edge of the fog. I followed it, my boots squelching in the mud as I moved closer to the water. "Riley," a voice whispered. I froze. It wasn't Jonas. It wasn't a stranger. It was my voice. Panic set in, but I couldn't turn back. The music pulled at me, drawing me deeper into the swamp. My flashlight flickered, the beam cutting through the dense fog. The trees seemed to close in around me, their twisted roots creating an almost cathedral-like canopy. Then I saw them. Shapes in the mist. Human silhouettes, standing still and silent among the trees. My breath caught in my throat as I realized they weren't people. They were shadows, dark voids that seemed to drink in the light around them. The music swelled, and the shadows began to move, their forms shifting and undulating like waves. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping my flashlight. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. The only answer was my own voice, repeated back to me in a mocking sing-song tone. "Who's there?" I ran. I didn't care about the mud sucking at my boots or the branches clawing at my arms. I just wanted to get back to the RV. But no matter how far I ran, the trail didn't look familiar. It twisted and turned, leading me in circles. The music followed, always just ahead, beckoning me forward. Finally, I burst into a clearing and saw the RV, its lights glowing like a beacon in the darkness. I collapsed inside, slamming the door behind me and locking it. My recorder was still running, the audio levels spiking as the music surged outside. I turned off the recorder and sat in silence, trying to steady my breathing. But the silence didn't last. A knock came at the door. 3 soft, deliberate taps. I didn't answer. My hands shook as I grabbed a knife from the kitchenette and backed into the corner. The knock came again, louder this time. And then, a voice. "Let me in, Riley." It was my voice. I don't remember falling asleep, but when I woke up, the swamp was quiet again. The RV was untouched, and the door was still locked. I packed my things in record time, determined to leave the basin for good. But as I started the engine, I noticed something on the windshield, a faint outline, like a handprint smeared in the dew. I didn't stop to look closer. I drove for hours, putting as much distance as I could between me and the swamp. But even now, safe in my apartment, I can't escape the sound. I hear it in my dreams, that haunting melody, always accompanied by the faintest whisper of my own voice, calling me back. I don't think I'll ever escape the devil's choir. It's inside me now. My name is Melissa Crane, and I'm 29 years old. I'm a freelance botanist, which is a fancy way of saying I spend a lot of time in the woods, cataloging plants that most people would walk right past. It's not a glamorous job, but it's mine. A few weeks ago, I drove my RV to Chicote State Park in Louisiana, chasing rumors of a rare orchid hidden deep in the forest. I was hoping for a breakthrough, something to make the long hours and meager pay worth it. What I found instead was something I can barely explain, something I'll never forget. I arrived late in the afternoon, parking my RV in a secluded spot near the edge of the forest. The campground was nearly empty, just the way I liked it. The air was heavy with the smell of damp earth and pine, and the lake shimmered in the distance, its surface smooth as glass. After unpacking my gear, I set out on a trail I'd marked on my map, a route that supposedly led to a grove where the orchids might be found. About an hour in, I noticed the forest growing unnaturally quiet. The usual sounds of birds and insects had faded, replaced by an eerie stillness that pressed against my ears. Then I saw it. A massive oak tree, its trunk wide enough to park a car inside, its bark gnarled and twisted like the lines on an old man's face. A hollow gaped at its center, dark and foreboding, big enough for a person to crawl through. The air around the tree felt different, thick, heavy, almost buzzing with static. Curious, I approached, pulling out my compass to get a bearing. The needle spun wildly, refusing to settle. That should have been my first clue to turn back, but I didn't. Instead, I stepped closer, peering into the hollow. The darkness inside seemed to shift and ripple, like ink spreading through water. For a moment I thought I heard something. A faint whisper, almost too soft to catch. I shook it off and marked the tree's location on my map. I'd come back tomorrow, I decided, with better light and a clearer head. That night, I couldn't sleep. The whispering I'd dismissed earlier seemed to follow me, faint and insistent, just at the edge of hearing. I lay in my bunk, staring at the ceiling of the RV, when a new sound joined the whispers. Footsteps, soft and deliberate, circling the RV. My breath caught. Grabbing my flashlight, I crept to the window and peeked outside. Nothing. Just the dark forest, shadows stretching long under the moonlight. I stepped back, heart pounding. and locked the door, something I hadn't bothered to do before. The whispers didn't stop. They seemed to grow louder, closer, until I swore they were coming from inside the RV. Covering my ears did nothing. I spent the rest of the night huddled under my blanket, praying for morning. The next day I met a man named Warren while hiking near the tree. He was older, with a lined face and a no-nonsense air, dressed in a park maintenance uniform that looked like it had seen better days. "You out here alone?" he asked, leaning on his rake. I nodded. "I'm a botanist. I'm looking for orchids." He frowned. "You've been near the hollow tree, haven't you?" The question startled me. "You know about it. Everyone around here does," he said grimly. "It's bad luck, that tree. You don't want to get too close." "Why?" I asked, trying to sound skeptical but feeling a knot tighten in my stomach. Warren wiped his hands on his pants. "People go missing around that tree. Always have. They say it calls to you, makes you see things, hear things, and if you're not careful, it'll take you." I laughed nervously. "That's just folklore, right?" He didn't laugh. "You think what you want, but take my advice. Stay away." I didn't stay away. I couldn't. That tree was like a thorn in my mind, pricking me every time I tried to think about something else. By the afternoon, I found myself back in the clearing, staring at the hollow tree. The air was just as heavy, the forest just as quiet. As I stepped closer, I felt a pull, like an invisible thread tugging me toward the hollow. My head buzzed with static, and the whispers returned, louder now, clearer. They weren't just random sounds. They were words, my name, repeated over and over in a chorus of voices. Melissa. Melissa! I stumbled back, my chest tight with fear. That's when I saw them, figures in the distance, flickering like the light of a dying candle. They looked human, but their forms were blurry, indistinct. They stood just beyond the tree, watching me, their faces unreadable. I ran. That night, the dreams came. I was standing in the clearing, the hollow tree towering above me. Its bark was alive, writhing with shadows that reached out like fingers. The hollow gaped wide, and I felt myself being pulled toward it, my feet moving without my consent. Inside the hollow was a darkness so deep it felt alive, and from that darkness came a voice. Not a whisper this time, but a roar. "Come to me." I woke gasping for air, my body drenched in sweat. The RV was silent, but the whispers still echoed in my head. I knew I couldn't leave until I understood what was happening. The next morning, I packed a bag with supplies and returned to the tree. The figures were gone, but the air was even heavier, the silence more oppressive. My compass spun wildly, and the sunlight seemed dimmer, weaker. As I approached, the whispers rose to a crescendo, and the hollow seemed to widen, the darkness within shifting and swirling. I pulled out my notebook, determined to sketch the tree, but my hands wouldn't stop shaking. Then the ground beneath me shifted, and I fell, tumbling into the hollow. Inside, the world was wrong. The forest was warped, the trees twisted and blackened, their branches clawing at the sky. The whispers were deafening now, a cacophony of voices that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The figures were there too, clearer now. They were human, or they had been once. Their faces were gaunt, their eyes hollow, their mouths moving in silent screams. They reached for me, their fingers like shadows, and I stumbled back, colliding with something solid. The entity. It rose from the roots of the hollow tree, its form shifting and indistinct, like smoke given shape. Its eyes glowed faintly, and its voice boomed in my mind. "You belong to me now." I fought the pull with everything I had, fumbling through my bag for something, anything. My fingers closed around a small tin of dried herbs, a mix I used to keep insects away. Desperate, I struck a match and lit the herbs, tossing them at the entity's roots. The fire caught, the flames consuming the dry wood and spreading quickly. The entity shrieked, a sound that pierced my skull, and the world around me began to collapse. I woke at the base of the tree, the hollow blackened and charred. The air was still, and the forest was silent. Warren found me hours later, his face grim as he helped me to my feet. "You burned it," he said, his voice a mix of relief and caution. "But it's not gone. Not entirely." I didn't ask what he meant. I didn't want to know. I left Chicote State Park that day, but the whispers followed me. They're quieter now, easier to ignore, but I know they'll never truly leave. The hollow tree may be dead, but whatever lived inside it left its mark on me. My name is Ethan Blake, and I'm 34 years old. For the past 5 years, I've been traveling the country in my RV, uncovering hidden pieces of history for my YouTube channel. It's a small channel, just a few thousand subscribers, but it's my passion. I've covered ghost towns, abandoned factories, forgotten trails. Every place has a story, and I've made it my mission to tell them. A few weeks ago, I went to Avery Island in Louisiana to film its untold history. What I found there was a story I'll never tell on camera. I arrived on a warm, humid afternoon. Avery Island is best known for its salt domes and Tabasco factory, but I wasn't interested in the tourist spots. I'd heard whispers about a place locals called the Forgotten Road. It wasn't on any map, and no one could tell me exactly where it was. The stories were vague. People who went looking for it never came back, or if they did, they were never the same. That was enough to hook me. A hidden road with a haunted past. It was perfect for my channel. I parked my RV on a quiet stretch of road near the edge of the forest and grabbed my camera, determined to find it. It took hours of hiking through overgrown trails before I saw it, a cracked, moss-covered stretch of asphalt cutting through the trees. The road was barely visible beneath layers of dirt and roots, but there was no mistaking it. My heart raced as I stepped onto it, my boots crunching against the brittle surface. The air felt different here, thicker, heavier. The usual sounds of the forest faded, replaced by an eerie silence that made my ears ring. I pulled out my camera and started filming, narrating my discovery. "This is it," I said, my voice breaking the oppressive quiet. "The Forgotten Road. It's real." As I walked, the road seemed endless, winding deeper into the forest. Time felt strange. The sunlight barely shifted, even though I knew hours must have passed. I saw signs of life. Rusted cars half buried in the earth, a child's shoe lying abandoned in the dirt, but no people. Then I saw her. She was sitting on a rock by the side of the road, her head bowed, her long hair hiding her face. She wore a faded dress, the kind you'd see in old photographs, and her bare feet were caked with mud. "Hey," I called out, lowering my camera. "Are you okay?" She looked up, her wide eyes locking onto mine. Her face was pale, almost colorless, and her expression was a mix of fear and exhaustion. "I'm lost," she said. Her voice was soft, hesitant, as if she wasn't sure she could trust me. "Me too," I said, trying to sound reassuring. "How long have you been out here?" She hesitated. "I don't know. A long time." There was something off about her, something I couldn't put my finger on. Her clothes were old-fashioned, and she seemed strangely calm for someone who claimed to be lost. Still, I couldn't leave her there. "I'm Ethan," I said. "I have an RV not far from here. Let me take you back and we'll figure out where you came from." She shook her head. "You can't leave. The road doesn't let you." I wanted to laugh, but her tone stopped me. She wasn't joking. She believed what she was saying. "What do you mean?" I asked. She glanced down the road, her eyes darkening. "It keeps you here. The longer you stay, the harder it is to leave. You should turn back before it's too late." Her words sent a chill through me, but I couldn't let them scare me off. "Come with me," I said, holding out a hand. "I can't," she whispered, standing. "But you should go." She turned and walked into the forest, disappearing between the trees. I called after her, but she didn't stop. As I continued down the road, I started to notice other things. Shadows flickered at the edges of my vision, shapes that disappeared the moment I turned to look. I saw a man crouching by a rusted car, frantically searching the ground as if he'd lost something. When I approached, he vanished, leaving only a faint impression in the dirt where he'd knelt. The further I went, the worse it got. My camera battery drained faster than it should have, and my watch stopped ticking. The air grew colder, and the shadows grew closer. Then I saw it, the Watcher. It was standing in the middle of the road, a tall, dark figure with no discernible features. Its body seemed to shimmer, like heat waves rising off asphalt, and it didn't move. It just stood there, staring. My instinct was to run, but my feet wouldn't cooperate. I stood frozen, my heart pounding, as the Watcher tilted its head, as if curious. "What do you want?" I whispered, my voice trembling. It didn't answer. Slowly, it turned and walked away, fading into the mist. I don't know how long I stood there before I finally moved. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, but I couldn't. I had to know where the road led. That was my mistake. As I pressed on, the road began to change. The asphalt cracked and crumbled, the edges consumed by the forest. The shadows grew darker, denser, until they surrounded me completely. The air smelled of decay, and the whispers began, soft, overlapping voices that seemed to come from all directions. "Ethan," they said, "come with us." I broke into a run, my breath ragged. The road twisted and turned, looping back on itself until I realized I was going in circles. Panic set in. I was trapped. That's when she appeared again, Irene. She stepped out of the shadows, her face illuminated by a faint, ghostly light. "I told you," she said. "The road doesn't let you leave." "Why are you here?" I demanded. "What is this place?" She looked at me sadly. "We're all trapped here. Everyone who's ever walked this road. It takes our curiosity, our need to know, and it keeps us." "Then how do I get out?" I asked, desperation creeping into my voice. "You can't," she said, "unless you let go." "Let go of what?" She didn't answer. Instead, she pointed down the road. The Watcher was there again, standing perfectly still, waiting. I knew what I had to do. If I stayed, the road would consume me, just as it had consumed Irene and the others. My camera and my map, symbols of my obsession with uncovering the unknown, were my tether to this place. With trembling hands, I smashed the camera against the asphalt, its lens shattering into pieces. Then I tore the map to shreds, letting the fragments scatter in the wind. The Watcher began to fade, its form dissolving into the mist. The road around me shifted, the forest brightening as sunlight broke through the canopy. I woke up near my RV, sprawled in the dirt. The road was gone, replaced by an overgrown trail. My equipment was destroyed, and my memory of what had happened was hazy, like a dream slipping through my fingers. I left Avery Island that day, vowing never to return. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear the whispers. And every now and then, when I close my eyes, I see the Watcher, standing in the distance, waiting for me to come back.